Amara woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. It was still early, and the sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the small town where she lived. The air was fresh, and the stillness of the morning felt like a quiet promise of another ordinary day. She stretched in her bed, a simple cot in a cramped room she shared with her younger sister. The family lived in a modest, weathered house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. Amara had always lived here, and she felt safe within these walls. Her father worked long hours as a mechanic at the local garage, and her mother stayed home, tending to the household chores and caring for her siblings. Today was no different. Amara had planned to spend the day helping her mother prepare lunch for the family, and later, she would go out to fetch water from the well. The routines of daily life felt almost comforting to her, a predictable rhythm she'd come to rely on. At just 14 years old, she was the oldest child and had grown accustomed to taking on more responsibilities. She had dreams, yes, but they were small ones, things like finishing school and becoming a teacher. Her life was simple, yet it felt full in its own way. But nothing could have prepared her for what would come next. It started as an ordinary day. She helped her mother with breakfast, the smell of fried plantains and scrambled eggs filling the kitchen. Her father had left early for work, as usual, and Amara's siblings were still asleep. As she sat down to eat, she noticed something odd. Her stomach had been feeling off for the past few days, a strange mix of nausea and dizziness that she couldn't shake. She had chalked it up to exhaustion, assuming it was just the result of the long hours she had been spending running errands and helping around the house. But this morning, the feeling was different. Stronger. Amara pushed the thought out of her mind, telling herself it would pass. She had no time to dwell on it, there was work to do, after all. But as the day wore on, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, more persistent than before, and she began to feel something else, a deep unease. What if it was something more serious? What if it was? The thought hit her like a wave, cold and overwhelming. She knew what it could be, but she refused to admit it to herself. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it became undeniable. The nausea, the dizziness, the missed period. It all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Amara's heart raced. She couldn't be sure, but there was no way to ignore the signs. The world around her seemed to narrow, as if she were suffocating under the weight of the thought. How could this be happening to her? She was just a child, still so young, too young to even understand what it all meant. The idea consumed her thoughts, but she pushed it to the back of her mind. She couldn't bear to think about it any longer, so she forced herself to focus on her chores. But by late afternoon, the unease had grown too much to ignore. She needed to know. With trembling hands, she made her way to the small pharmacy at the end of the street. She couldn't tell anyone, not yet. Not her parents, not her friends. Not anyone. She couldn't bear the thought of them finding out, not now, not in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The rumors, the judgment, the shame, it would be too much. She couldn't let that happen. Inside the pharmacy, Amara stood at the counter, trying to act normal, but the cold sweat on her forehead betrayed her. She barely heard the cashier as she asked if she needed anything. The small packet she held in her hand felt like a weight too heavy to carry. She paid, leaving without a word, the bag with the test feeling like it was burning through her clothes. When she got home, she went straight to her room and locked the door behind her. She was alone now. It was just her and the test. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small, unassuming box. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a plastic stick. She didn't know how long it took, minutes, hours, it felt like forever, but eventually, the result appeared. 2 pink lines. Her stomach turned, and tears filled her eyes. The test was positive. She was pregnant. Amara's mind raced. She couldn't believe it. How could this happen? She hadn't even kissed anyone seriously, let alone, how could she be pregnant? A wave of shock and disbelief swept over her. She felt frozen in place, unable to move, to think. She wasn't ready for this. She was just a child. She had so much ahead of her, so many dreams and plans. How could this change everything in an instant? The sound of her father's truck pulling into the driveway startled her, snapping her back to reality. She quickly stuffed the test into a drawer and tried to compose herself. But deep down, she knew that this was the moment that would change everything. Her father came into the house a few minutes later, his heavy boots echoing on the floor as he greeted her. He didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Amara quickly wiped her tears and plastered on a smile. But inside, she felt as though her world had shattered. What was she going to do now? Who could she tell? What would her family think? What would her father think? Amara didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a journey that would force her to make decisions she never thought she'd have to face. Her life, once full of small dreams and simple routines, was about to take a dramatic turn. And nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days were a blur for Amara. She moved through them like a shadow, disconnected from the world around her. Her mind was consumed with the one undeniable truth: she was pregnant. The weight of the revelation was suffocating, and she couldn't escape it. Every morning, as the sun rose, she went through the motions, helping her mother with chores, attending school, and pretending that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She could no longer look at her father the same way, no longer take for granted the comfort of her home. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath her feet was sinking with the realization that her life was on a path she hadn't chosen. The guilt gnawed at her, but there was something else: fear. Fear of the future, fear of the unknown, fear of what would happen when her father found out. Her mother had been strangely silent on the matter, only offering small, worried glances whenever Amara's eyes met hers. There was no comfort there, no reassurance. It was as if her mother was waiting for her to figure it out on her own, unwilling to speak on what neither of them dared acknowledge. Amara's father, on the other hand, had been more distant than usual. He came home late each night, often too tired to engage in conversation, and spent long hours in the garage working on cars. But Amara knew it wasn't just exhaustion that kept him away. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't say it out loud. It was on a Sunday afternoon, just as the heat of the day began to cool, that Amara decided to tell him. She couldn't carry the secret anymore. It had been eating away at her, stealing her peace of mind, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. She found him in the garage, tinkering with an old engine, his back to her. His work was his escape, a place where he could lose himself in the mechanics of life and forget about the problems he didn't want to face. "Papa," she said softly, her voice trembling as she stood in the doorway. He didn't turn around immediately. There was a long pause, and she could almost hear his thoughts as he wiped his hands on a rag, trying to brace himself for whatever was coming. "Yes, Amara?" His voice was calm, almost detached, as though he already knew what she was going to say. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground. "Papa, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like an explosion, the silence that followed louder than any reaction she could have expected. He froze. His back was still to her, but she could feel the tension building, like the moment before a storm hits. There was no immediate anger, no tears, just a thick silence that made the air feel suffocating. "What did you say?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost unreadable. "I'm pregnant, Papa." Her voice cracked as she said the words again, louder this time, as if speaking them aloud might somehow make them less real. The silence stretched on. Amara waited for the storm, the angry words, the outburst. But instead, her father turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. His eyes were wide, and for the first time, Amara saw something there that she hadn't expected: fear. Fear for her, but also fear for himself, as if he were afraid that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now crumbling in front of him. His gaze shifted from her face to the floor, then back to her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost as if speaking the words out loud would give them weight he couldn't bear, he asked quietly, "How long have you known?" I just found out a few days ago," Amara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, though the gesture felt more like a reflex than understanding. His face contorted with a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, confusion, but above all, shame. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice rising now. "Why keep something like this from me, from the family?" Amara could feel the tears starting to sting at her eyes, but she fought them back. "I didn't know how," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what you would say, Papa. I didn't want to disappoint you." At this, something inside her father seemed to snap. His shoulders tightened, and the anger she had feared began to surface. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "Disappoint me?" he shouted. "You've ruined everything, Amara. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it's all falling apart because of this." His words were harsh, jagged, cutting through her like shards of glass. Amara recoiled, her chest tightening as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to react like this. She had hoped for some kind of understanding, some kind of comfort, but instead, she found only anger and disappointment. Her father took a few deep breaths, trying to calm himself, but his rage didn't subside. "You've made a fool of yourself," he muttered, turning away from her. "I can't believe this is happening. You've brought shame on this family, Amara. You're not a child anymore. You're a disappointment." The words cut deeper than anything she had ever felt. She had expected him to be upset, to be disappointed, but this was something different. This was betrayal. This was a side of her father she had never seen before. "I'm sorry, Papa," Amara whispered, her voice thick with the weight of her shame. She wanted to say more, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Her father didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the garage, leaving Amara standing alone in the empty room. She felt as though the ground beneath her had cracked open, leaving her stranded in a chasm of her own making. That night, her father didn't come home. Her mother stayed in her room, her silence heavier than any words could have been. Amara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She could still hear her father's angry words echoing in her mind. He had kicked her out of his heart, just like that. The next morning, her father came home, but there was no apology. No explanation. He simply walked past Amara without a word, as if she were invisible. And just like that, her world shifted. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about her family, had been shattered in an instant. There was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Amara was alone in a way she had never been before. And she had no idea where she would go next. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and hurt for Amara. She had never felt so isolated, so abandoned. Her father's rejection had cut deeper than any physical wound, and the silence that stretched between her and her mother felt suffocating. There was no comfort to be found in her home anymore. It was as if everything she had known, every bond she had taken for granted, had cracked apart. She couldn't look her father in the eye, and when she did, she saw only disappointment staring back at her. Amara spent her days walking the streets of the town, aimlessly, not really knowing where she was going or why. The weight of the secret she carried seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. She couldn't talk to her friends, they wouldn't understand. Her classmates were too busy with their own lives, their own dramas, and the thought of them finding out about her situation filled her with dread. What would they say? What would they think? The shame was unbearable. Every night, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in her mind. Her father's words echoed in her head, "You've ruined everything. You've brought shame on this family." She couldn't escape them, no matter how hard she tried. But more than the anger, it was the abandonment that hurt the most. Her father's silence, his refusal to acknowledge her pain, left her feeling like a stranger in her own home. She had hoped he would come around, that he would soften, that somehow he would find a way to understand. But he hadn't. Instead, he had shut her out completely. Amara knew she couldn't stay in that house, not with the way things had become. But where could she go? She had no relatives who could take her in, and she couldn't burden her friends with this. The idea of leaving, of running away, crossed her mind more than once, but where would she even go? She was just a girl, a 14-year-old girl with no place to turn, no answers, no support. One afternoon, as she sat on a bench by the town's main road, lost in her thoughts, she saw a familiar face approach. It was her childhood friend, Kemi. They had grown up together, their families close-knit, always sharing stories and laughs. Kemi's parents were kind and welcoming, and Amara had always felt safe in their home. But now, standing before her, Kemi's face was full of concern. She had heard the rumors, and Amara knew that she must have sensed something was wrong. "You've been avoiding me," Kemi said softly, sitting down next to her. Her tone was gentle, but there was a clear undercurrent of worry. Amara turned her face away, feeling the tears welling up in her eyes again. She had spent so much time trying to hide from the truth, but now, in front of Kemi, she couldn't. She had no strength left to keep up the facade. "I don't know what to do, Kemi," Amara whispered. "Everything is falling apart. My father, he doesn't want me anymore. I'm pregnant, and he's just shut me out." Kemi reached out, gently placing a hand on Amara's shoulder, her voice filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Amara. I had no idea things had gotten this bad. But you're not alone, okay? You have me. We'll figure this out together." Amara shook her head, feeling the weight of the situation crushing her. "I can't fix this, Kemi. I don't even know what to do. I'm scared. I'm so scared." Kemi paused for a moment, thinking carefully before speaking again. "You don't have to fix everything right now. All you have to do is take it one step at a time. I can't tell you what to do, but I know that you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you, no matter what." The warmth in Kemi's voice was like a lifeline, pulling Amara out of the dark space she had been trapped in for days. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to lean on, someone who didn't look at her with judgment or pity, but with understanding and care. For the first time in days, Amara felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wouldn't all fall apart. Maybe there was still a way through this. The two friends spent the afternoon talking, Kemi listening patiently as Amara poured out her heart. Kemi didn't have all the answers, but she gave Amara something more valuable, her presence. She wasn't pushing her to make decisions or telling her what she should do. Instead, she offered her support and reminded her that she was still a person, still someone deserving of love and care, even if her family couldn't see it right now. When Amara returned home later that evening, the weight on her shoulders was still there, but it felt a little lighter. She had made a decision, she couldn't stay in that house any longer. Her father's rejection had torn something in her that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired, but she still had her future to consider. She couldn't afford to drown in her father's disappointment, to allow his anger and shame to define her. The next day, after her father had gone to work, Amara packed a small bag with clothes and a few personal items. She didn't know where she would go yet, but she knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay and wait for something to change. She had to take control of her own life, no matter how uncertain the road ahead seemed. Kemi had offered to help, to let her stay with her family until she figured things out. The idea of living in someone else's home, under someone else's roof, felt like a strange concept to Amara. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on taking care of others before herself. But now, more than ever, she realized she needed help. She needed to lean on others, even if it felt uncomfortable. Amara looked at her reflection in the mirror one last time before leaving. She barely recognized the girl who stared back at her, this girl who had lost so much, but who still had the courage to fight. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew that she had to keep moving forward. She couldn't go back. She couldn't undo what had already happened. All she could do was face the future, step by uncertain step. Every time she passed a mirror or looked at herself, she saw the changes. She had always been the quiet, studious girl who blended into the background, unnoticed by most. Now, she was carrying a child. A child that had come from a mistake she couldn't take back, a mistake that had shattered everything she had known. She wondered if people saw it in her eyes, in the way she held herself. The shame was something she couldn't escape, even when she tried to hide it behind a mask of strength. Kemi was the only one who truly knew the extent of what had happened, though. She didn't press Amara for more details, didn't ask her about her father or what had led to the confrontation. She simply offered a shoulder to lean on in her presence, something Amara had desperately needed. But even Kemi's compassion couldn't erase the gnawing emptiness that lingered in Amara's heart. It was late one evening when Amara received the phone call. The one she had been dreading. It was from her mother. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she was unsure of how to speak to her daughter, unsure of how to approach the subject that had torn them apart. Amara, I don't know how to say this, her mother began. Your father, he's not taking this well. He hasn't been himself. He's been drinking more than usual, and I'm worried about him. But I'm worried about you too. Amara's heart dropped at the mention of her father. She had been trying so hard to push him out of her mind, trying to forget the anger in his eyes, the way he had rejected her. But hearing about him again, hearing the worry in her mother's voice, brought it all back. She didn't know what to feel. She had expected her father's reaction, had expected the anger, the rejection, but she hadn't expected it to consume him in this way. I don't know what to do, Mama, Amara replied, her voice barely audible. I didn't want any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt him. Her mother's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. It was as if she too was searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. I just want you to come home, Amara. I don't know what will happen between you and your father, but I don't want you to feel like you're alone. We can figure this out together. Please come home. Amara felt the tears welling up again. She had longed for this, longed for the comfort of her mother's arms, the sense of security she once had in her home. But she also knew that things would never be the same again. Her father's rejection had carved a permanent wound in their family, one that might never heal. She didn't know if she could go back to that place, to the tension, to the anger. It wasn't just about her anymore. There was a child growing inside her, and that changed everything. I don't know, Mama, she whispered. I don't think I can come back yet. There was another long pause, and then her mother spoke again, her voice filled with resignation. I understand. Just know that you're still my daughter, no matter what happens. And I'm here when you're ready. Amara hung up the phone and sat on Kemi's bed, her emotions swirling like a storm. She had wanted to go back to her mother, to find solace in the place she had once felt safe. But her father's anger had left a scar so deep that she couldn't just walk back into that house and pretend everything was okay. There was a fear in her now, a fear that her father's rejection had changed the way he would look at her forever. The next few days were spent in a fog of indecision. Amara didn't know what to do. She couldn't stay with Kemi forever. Eventually, she would have to face her family, face the reality of what had happened. But what would that reality look like? Would her father ever accept her again? Would he forgive her for the mistakes she had made? Could she forgive him for abandoning her when she needed him most? In the midst of her uncertainty, Kemi continued to be a steady presence in her life. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Kemi turned to her and said, "Amara, I've been thinking. I know things are hard right now, but you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. I believe in you." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Amara needed to hear. She had been so consumed by the fear of what was to come that she had forgotten the most important thing: she wasn't alone. She had people who cared about her, people who would stand by her no matter what. The reality of her situation still loomed large, but for the first time in a long while, Amara allowed herself to hope. She didn't know what the future would hold, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way through this. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be many more challenges to face, but she wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't ready to let this define her. The next morning, Amara made a decision. She wouldn't go back to her father's house, not yet, at least. But she would take steps to rebuild her life, to take control of the future she wanted. She would finish her schooling, figure out how to take care of herself and her baby, and find a way to heal. She wasn't sure what the road ahead would look like, but she was determined to walk it, no matter how difficult or lonely it might be. She had the power to shape her own destiny now. And she would not let her past define her future. Amara's resolve solidified in the weeks that followed. She had taken the first step by deciding not to return to her father's home, and now it was time to build her future, no matter how uncertain or difficult it seemed. Kemi's family remained a constant source of support, but Amara knew that relying on others forever wasn't an option. She had to be strong, for herself, and for the child she was carrying. Each day felt like a battle, but with each passing day, she felt herself growing stronger. She had always been a diligent student, a girl who took pride in her work and loved to learn. Now, with the pressure of her situation bearing down on her, she threw herself into her studies with a renewed sense of purpose. Her teachers at school had noticed her transformation, and while some of them seemed unsure how to approach her, others offered their support in subtle ways. They didn't know the full extent of what she was going through, but they could see the weight she carried. One of her teachers, Mrs. Okoro, had been particularly kind. She often stayed after class to chat with Amara, offering words of encouragement and advice. "You're one of the brightest students in this class, Amara," she had told her one afternoon. "Don't let this situation define who you are. You have a future ahead of you, and nothing is going to stop you from achieving your dreams. Just take it one day at a time." Those words stuck with Amara, echoing in her mind whenever she began to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of what lay ahead. She had never considered giving up on her studies before, but now, with a baby on the way, the future seemed more uncertain than ever. How could she raise a child while still being a student? How could she balance the demands of motherhood and school? It was a question she asked herself daily, and one that didn't have an easy answer. But Amara knew one thing for certain: she couldn't quit. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. She wasn't the same girl who had been cast out of her home, rejected by her father. She had learned to stand on her own, to take charge of her destiny, no matter how impossible it seemed. The road ahead was still filled with obstacles, but she was determined to face them head-on. Kemi remained by her side, offering not only emotional support but practical help. When Amara began to show more, Kemi would go with her to doctor appointments, making sure she had everything she needed. They were both still so young, but their bond had deepened in a way that Amara never expected. It was during one of these doctor visits that Amara realized just how much Kemi had become her rock. "Amara," Kemi said quietly as they sat in the waiting room, "I know things are tough, but you're going to be a great mom. You're already stronger than most people I know." Amara smiled, but her heart ached. She had no idea how she would handle everything, how she could possibly be ready for motherhood. But Kemi's words gave her the strength to keep going. For the first time, Amara allowed herself to hope. Over time, the people in Amara's town began to notice her strength as well. Some had heard the rumors about her pregnancy and her father's rejection, but most had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. Slowly, the whispers began to die down, and the judgment that had once followed her seemed to fade into the background. People started to look at Amara not as a failure, but as someone who had endured something unimaginable and was still standing. She became an unspoken symbol of resilience, though she didn't always realize it. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, working on an assignment, Kemi's father entered the room. He had always been kind to her, but tonight he looked at her with a kind of quiet admiration that made Amara pause. "You've come a long way, Amara," he said gently. "I've watched you these past few months. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of you. And I think it's time we talk about your future, about the things you're going to need to succeed." Amara looked up at him, a little surprised by his words. She had never imagined that anyone, let alone Kemi's father, would offer her a kind word. His offer was unexpected, but exactly what she needed. She had felt so alone in this journey, so unsure of how to move forward. But his words gave her a glimpse of the support she had been searching for all along. "I've been thinking about college," Amara said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "I've always wanted to go, but I thought it was impossible, especially now. But maybe I can find a way. Maybe I can still make something of myself, despite everything that's happened." Kemi's father nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I believe you can. And I think we can help you get there. You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure out a plan together." That moment was a turning point for Amara. It was the first time someone had truly believed in her potential, had seen beyond her circumstances. The idea of going to college had once seemed like an unreachable dream, but now, with Kemi's father offering his support, it felt within her grasp. She wasn't just a teenage mother anymore, she was someone who could make her dreams a reality, someone who could defy the odds stacked against her. As Amara's pregnancy progressed, she continued to focus on her education. There were still many late nights spent studying, many mornings when she felt exhausted and overwhelmed. But each day, she grew stronger, more determined. And when the time finally came for her to give birth, she did so with a sense of calm that she hadn't expected. The birth was difficult, as she had feared, but when she held her baby for the first time, all the pain and fear melted away. This little life was her future, her hope, her reason to keep going. The days that followed were filled with sleepless nights and challenges she never could have anticipated, but Amara took it all in stride. She was a mother now, and nothing would stop her from providing the best future possible for her child. Amara's journey wasn't easy, and it didn't have a perfect ending. But she had learned more about herself in the past months than she ever thought possible. She had faced rejection, fear, and heartbreak, and she had survived. And now, as she looked down at her baby, she knew that she had everything she needed to move forward, to create a life that was hers to shape. She wasn't defined by her past mistakes, and she wouldn't let her circumstances dictate her future. She was stronger than she had ever been, and she would continue to rise, no matter the challenges ahead. Months passed, and Amara settled into her new life as a young mother. The journey had not been easy, but each day brought with it small victories that propelled her forward. The overwhelming exhaustion from sleepless nights with a newborn was met with an unexpected resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Each time she cradled her child in her arms, a sense of purpose filled her heart. This tiny human, with their soft cries and innocent eyes, was now her world, her reason to push through the hardest moments. Kemi remained her constant, offering both emotional and practical support whenever Amara needed it. She helped with babysitting when Amara needed a few hours to catch up on schoolwork, and whenever Amara had a moment to breathe, they would talk about their dreams, their futures, and how life had taken them down paths neither of them could have predicted. Kemi had been a rock, but Amara was no longer a passive recipient of help. She had learned to navigate her own challenges, and now, more than ever, she was determined to not just survive, but thrive. The time came for Amara to return to school full-time. The idea of balancing a baby and her education felt daunting, but her resolve was unwavering. She had always been a good student, and now, she needed to prove to herself that she could excel despite the overwhelming responsibilities of motherhood. The early mornings were the hardest. She'd wake up hours before the first light of day to feed her baby, change their clothes, and make sure everything was ready before rushing off to school. The other students didn't know the weight she carried, the battles she fought in silence. To them, she was just another student in the back of the classroom, but to Amara, those hours of quiet study were an escape, a chance to focus on something that was just for her. However, as much as she wanted to keep her life private, the whispers from her classmates persisted. The rumor mill churned as they spoke about the young girl with a baby, the one who had been kicked out of her house by her father. It didn't help that Amara was still so young, and some couldn't fathom how she had managed to get through it all. But it was the unspoken judgment from her peers that stung the most. Some would look at her with pity, others with curiosity, but the most painful were the ones who looked away, as if her struggle was too much for them to bear. Yet, amidst the whispers and the stares, there was a quiet transformation occurring within Amara. She no longer cared about what others thought of her. She had been through the worst, and no one's judgment could hold her back. Every day, she walked into school with her head held high, a quiet defiance in her every step. She wasn't just another teenage mother trying to survive, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her hard work started to pay off. Her grades, which had always been good but lacked passion, began to shine. The classes that once seemed like a blur were now a way for Amara to build her future, brick by brick. Her teachers, seeing her dedication, began to offer their support more openly. Mrs. Okoro, who had always been a guiding light, encouraged Amara to apply for scholarships and internships. "You have something that most people don't," she told Amara one afternoon after class. "You have drive. And if you channel that drive, there's no telling what you can achieve." Those words stuck with Amara, but more than that, they awakened something in her. She realized that she had the power to turn her situation into something greater. She wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just a girl who had made a mistake. She was a young woman with a future, and she wasn't going to let her past define her. The weeks turned into months, and before she knew it, Amara was standing at the front of her class during graduation, clutching her diploma in one hand and her baby in the other. The journey had been long and difficult, but the pride in her chest as she stood there was undeniable. She had done it. The time came for Amara to return to school full-time. The idea of balancing a baby and her education felt daunting, but her resolve was unwavering. She had always been a good student, and now, she needed to prove to herself that she could excel despite the overwhelming responsibilities of motherhood. The early mornings were the hardest. She'd wake up hours before the first light of day to feed her baby, change their clothes, and make sure everything was ready before rushing off to school. The other students didn't know the weight she carried, the battles she fought in silence. To them, she was just another student in the back of the classroom, but to Amara, those hours of quiet study were an escape, a chance to focus on something that was just for her. However, as much as she wanted to keep her life private, the whispers from her classmates persisted. The rumor mill churned as they spoke about the young girl with a baby, the one who had been kicked out of her house by her father. It didn't help that Amara was still so young, and some couldn't fathom how she had managed to get through it all. But it was the unspoken judgment from her peers that stung the most. Some would look at her with pity, others with curiosity, but the most painful were the ones who looked away, as if her struggle was too much for them to bear. Yet, amidst the whispers and the stares, there was a quiet transformation occurring within Amara. She no longer cared about what others thought of her. She had been through the worst, and no one's judgment could hold her back. Every day, she walked into school with her head held high, a quiet defiance in her every step. She wasn't just another teenage mother trying to survive, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her hard work started to pay off. Her grades, which had always been good but lacked passion, began to shine. The classes that once seemed like a blur were now a way for Amara to build her future, brick by brick. Her teachers, seeing her dedication, began to offer their support more openly. Mrs. Okoro, who had always been a guiding light, encouraged Amara to apply for scholarships and internships. "You have something that most people don't," she told Amara one afternoon after class. "You have drive. And if you channel that drive, there's no telling what you can achieve." Those words stuck with Amara, but more than that, they awakened something in her. She realized that she had the power to turn her situation into something greater. She wasn't just a statistic. She wasn't just a girl who had made a mistake. She was a young woman with a future, and she wasn't going to let her past define her. The weeks turned into months, and before she knew it, Amara was standing at the front of her class during graduation, clutching her diploma in one hand and her baby in the other. The journey had been long and difficult, but the pride in her chest as she stood there was undeniable. She had done it. She had overcome every obstacle thrown her way and had come out stronger on the other side. When the ceremony ended, and the applause died down, Amara felt the weight of her accomplishment settle on her shoulders. She had done what many had thought impossible, but she hadn't done it alone. She had done it with the unwavering support of Kemi, her teachers, and her community. And she had done it for her child, who had become her driving force, her reason to keep moving forward. But even with the diploma in her hand, Amara knew that the hardest part was still ahead of her. College. A new chapter that she had dreamed about for years. It seemed so far out of reach when she had first gotten pregnant, but now, with the encouragement of her teachers and the help of scholarships, it was an attainable goal. She knew that juggling college and motherhood would be a difficult feat, but she had learned to be resourceful, to manage time, and to never stop believing in herself. As she stood in front of her classmates and peers, Amara realized that she had already accomplished something many people would never understand. She had survived rejection, uncertainty, and hardship, and had emerged stronger. She wasn't waiting for permission to live her life, she was taking control of it. And as the crowd cheered and her baby cooed in her arms, Amara knew that this was just the beginning. Her story was not one of defeat but of triumph. A triumph that would inspire not only those around her, but also herself, for the rest of her life. As she walked out of the auditorium that day, her diploma clutched firmly in her hand, Amara glanced down at her child, who smiled up at her with innocent trust. She had come so far, and the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But she was ready. Ready to take on the world for herself, for her child, and for the future that she was determined to create.